everybody, I'm Nora Burrows. Today we are going to make a quilt with dogs on it. I got this fabric with dogs on it that I cut up. Here's one little dog. Is that not the cutest thing? So I got this fabric from a Darlene Michaud Penny Auction. I'm not going to go into too much detail about who Darlene is and her YouTube video because I have a whole video on that and I will link to that in the description. Go ahead and check that out and then come back and let's make this dog quilt. Basically, I got this package from Darlene that I paid for, more than a penny, filled with all different kinds of crazy fabric, and I said I want to make a project with something in this package, and the dog fabric is what I picked out. I had said in the last video that I was going to make 25 blocks, so the quilt would be 5 across by 5 down, but I think actually I'm going to do 5 across by 6 down, so that would be 30 blocks. So I'm going to make 30 blocks. Each block is going to have a dog and an accessory. So for example, this, and when I say accessory, I just mean a little thing. So like this dog might go with this dog might go with this, he might have the woof. I'm going to start making my blocks. As you can see, I've already started to attach fabric here. And I'm going to kind of do the same method for each block, no matter what the dog or the accessory is. So let me show you with one. I cut some of these strips. I attached a strip. This was my smaller block, and I need it to be the same height as my dog block. I added some to the top and the bottom, a little more than I needed. You can see that it goes a little bit higher because that will be trimmed. I'm going to take next a strip and attach it to the left-hand side. That way, at that point, this block will be ready to be attached to this block. I'll trim everything and then I'll be able to attach background to the side. I've sewed on this piece to all of the dog toys. Next, I will attach the dog to this part here. So I'll sew right sides together and I'll lose this white, which is exactly what I want. I just want it to be kind of like that. Okay, so I'll do that with all of these. I have my dogs attached now. I'm going to straighten out this line on the top and the bottom with my rotary cutter and ruler and mat. Flip it over. Do the same on the other side. Now you would think that the next steps would involve kind of circling this piece here in background fabric, right? But that's actually not what we're gonna do yet, and then put a strip on the top and the bottom. Because all of these dogs, you know, are a different size, what I wanna do is take, when I'm done getting all of the pieces to this step, so I'll do the same with this that I did with these, I'll be able to measure the length and the height, and whichever pieces are the longest and the tallest, I'll take those measurements and I'll be able to add fabric onto the top, the bottom, and the sides so that they're all the same size at that point. Let me show you what I mean. I'm gonna go ahead and get to this point with all of these other pieces. I have my dog blocks sewn together here. They're all sewn up to the same exact step. This is the one that we did together, and then this dog block obviously is done in the same exact way, attaching this side piece, and the dogs with the little accessory above them are also done in the same way. I attached the 2 pieces onto the accessory, added a strip to this piece, and then added the dog. So that's done the same way except next to each other, it's above and below. Next, what I need to do is figure out how big I want these blocks to be. So let's just take a look at this dog for a minute. The width of this dog here is about 6 inches. I think I want my block to be 8 inches square, which means I need to add 1 inch to each side, and then I need to add a 1/2 inch to take into account the seam allowance, the 1/4 I'll lose from this block and the 1/4 I'll lose from the attached piece to both sides. So I'm going to cut
1.5 inch strips, but I'm actually going to cut them a little tiny bit bigger than that because I like to trim my block down to the right size at the end. Once I put the strips onto the sides that will make it 8 inches wide, I'll then put strips on the top and bottom. So I'll make these strips a little bigger than 3 inches and attach those at that point. I sewed the ends onto this piece here. Then I cut my strips to go on the top and bottom. So it'll look like this. So I'll put one on the bottom and one on the top. Now it looks longer than wider because it will become shorter once sewn together because of the seam allowance. But let me tell you what I'm thinking. I do have a thought, and that is that once these are all sewn together into a block, these are going to look like pretty teeny tiny pieces in this like sea of blue. And I think that's going to be similar to all of the other types of dogs as well. It's just too much fabric around the edge. But I have a solution. I have a thought, which I will get to after I do the next step. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew all of these pieces to this dog here, and then I'm going to do the same process with all of the other dogs, sewing pieces to the sides and then sewing pieces to the tops and bottoms, measuring to make sure that the finished block size is 8 inches by 8 inches. And then I'll tell you what I'm thinking to kind of break up some of this space. I've sewn these all into squares, all 4 of the different types of dogs. I haven't trimmed them down yet, except these ones I did trim down. So these ones here are exactly 8 inches in diameter, but the rest need to be trimmed. What I was thinking, like I mentioned before, so on some of these, I don't mind kind of the extra space. There's kind of a lot going on here with this green fabric, and then, you know, this red fabric, there's kind of a lot going on. And maybe I don't need to do anything. Maybe I just, once I trim them, it'll be fine. But what I was thinking is that I could take some of this Rickrack and kind of just sew a little strip onto the top and bottom. Now I only have, I don't want to buy anything for this project, except I might need to buy some batting. But besides the batting, I really want to use what I have. So I have like not that much yellow and then not that much blue. But I could put them maybe on just 2 different ones. For example, I could just do, you know, the yellow with a little bit of blue Rickrack and, you know, the blue with the yellow. I could have, now it's too late, but I could have saved myself some Rickrack and kind of put them on either side of the flower there. The nice thing about it is that it adds a little bit of texture, which I really like. I think I might not do this, but I'm not going to eliminate it. If I did, what I would do is trim these blocks down to 8 by 8, sew on the Rickrack by top stitching it. So I'm going to think about that. But in the meantime, I'm going to trim all my blocks down to be 8 by 8. I think they're looking really good. I'm really happy with them. And then what I'm going to do after that is add probably a 2-inch border to each block in a fabric that I haven't used yet. Now, unfortunately, I really only have 3 fabrics in you know, yardage that I haven't used yet. And then I have a bunch of smaller pieces like this one. This one I could probably only get enough to do 1 block out of this, but I do want to use that. And then I have this one here, this heart fabric. What I could do is, you know, mix and match some of these. So for some of the red, they might be on this blue, light blue fabric, and for some of the green might be on this darker blue fabric, but then also kind of mix in some blocks with these other pieces here. So I'm going to cut all my blocks down to 8 by 8, and then I'll cut a bunch of 2.5-inch strips and attach those to my blocks. I did decide to add the Rickrack to my blocks here, and I wanted to show you what I'm doing. So instead of cutting a piece of Rickrack for each block, I'm leaving this Rickrack just nice and long right on its spool here. And when I get to the end of a block,
I take my next block, I make sure my needle is down, I put my presser foot up, I line up the block where I want it, put the presser foot down, and keep going. Now when I'm done with all my pieces, they'll all be attached with the Rickrack, but I can just cut that Rickrack apart at that point. Now that I'm at the end of the block, I put the needle down, take my next block, lift the presser foot, and keep going. Now I can just cut all of these apart. Next, I'll add a strip along the bottom. I am really happy with how this Rickrack came out on these quilt blocks. It really adds the touch that it needed. Same with this one here. I think that's really fun. And it doesn't bother me that the other quilt blocks don't have them. I think it'll just be, you know, it'll just be different. This one definitely doesn't need the Rickrack. I think it would get lost. This one could have used it, but I didn't have another color, so I think it'll be fine. I've decided that instead of doing different backgrounds for each of these blocks, because as I mentioned, I wanted to kind of do a little border around each block, I'm gonna do this blue, this light blue gingham for everyone, because I think it goes with each block nicely. So it goes with the blue, it goes with the yellow. I think that looks good. These blocks are all trimmed down. The red looks great, especially with that blue Rickrack against the blue gingham in the background. So let's see, did we see the green? There's the green. The green goes the least, I would say, because it's kind of a lot of pattern going on there, but I think it'll be fine. So I went ahead and cut a bunch of 2-inch strips of these, because I've decided I want the border to be 1.5 inches. So I had to cut 2-inch strips to allow for seam allowance. So let's see, let's take one of these blocks, and what I'll do is sew right sides together, 1/4 inch seam allowance. Same with the other side. And I open it up, and then I'll attach a strip to the top and to the bottom. It's a couple days later, and all my quilt blocks here are done. I just have to trim up some of the edges here, but they're looking really good. I'm really happy with them, especially the ones with this Rickrack. Last thing we have to do to finish our quilt top is to add some sashing. So sashing is the strips of fabric that go in between the quilt blocks. So let's take a look at a couple options. Here are the 2 options. Here's the first one. It's this red polka dot, and it just is a little much. I think it might be a little bit too bold to have as such a big portion of the quilt. And then over here is the blue, which I also kind of am not completely in love with, but I think I'm gonna go with this blue. I think it's just a little bit easier on the eyes. I wish I had something that was a little bit lighter that I haven't already used, but I think it'll be okay. It'll still be cool. I have finished the quilt top, and I think it's looking really good. The blue is a little darker than I would have liked, but I do like that the blue has kind of this same polka dots as the red there. I think that's a nice touch. And I don't mind it. I don't mind the blue. Here you can see the dogs a little bit more. And then I just randomly kind of spaced out the different colors. I just wanted to make sure that, you know, there weren't 2 greens next to each other, 2 blues. But besides that, I kind of just randomly did that. So that's looking good. And I showed it to my husband last night, and he said, "Oh, that's great. Looks good." And he said, "Can I give you some constructive criticism?" And I said, "Of course." And he said, "I think you should do a border of cream around the outside." So he's talking about, like, on the outside of this blue, do a border of cream. And I was like, cream? That doesn't make any sense, because like all the background here is like white. I was like, why would I do cream with like all the white? He's like, okay, well then just put a white border on around the outside. And I was like, okay. I was like, I appreciate your constructive criticism, but I'm not gonna do that. So you can tell me if he was in fact right and I should have put a border of white around the outside. And then he said that I should do the binding, and he did use the term binding. He's learning like these real quilting terms, which is amazing. But he said I should do the binding in like a bright color, and I said, well, I was gonna just do the binding in this blue, and he was like, no, you should do the binding in a different color than the sashing. He didn't say sashing. He's not that quite that far along in the quilting terms, but he said I should do a different color than this blue. But I'm not gonna take his advice. So I'm not gonna do another border around the outside. And so this is the quilt top, I'm leaving it like this. And I am gonna use this same blue for the binding, which is actually something that I never do. I never use the same fabric binding that is right up against the binding, because I like to have that kind of like contrasted pop. But for this quilt, again, I'm trying to work with what I have, and I just don't have anything that I feel would really go, and I don't really want to repeat any of these inner fabrics. Like I could do the binding in like this red or something, but I feel like that affects the balance of the pieces, the blocks that are on the inside of the quilt. So I'm not gonna do that. I have my backing here. It's this kind of green, light green and yellow plaid. So I think that'll go well. And I have a big enough piece that I don't have to piece the backing together. You also know that I almost always love doing a pieced backing. It's like one of my favorite things. But for this project in particular, I'm really thankful that I don't have to piece it. If this was more of like an artistic quilt or something, or a statement quilt, I would be more inclined to do the piece backing. So I need to make my quilt sandwich, and the way that I do that is I use my adhesive spray. I don't know these people. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but I do love their spray. Now, people tend to shy away from the spray basting because they say it like smells and it gets like chemicals all in the air and stuff like that. And this particular brand, I have never had that problem with. I don't smell it at all when I spray it. And I do it right in my dining room, and I never feel like the carpet gets sticky or anything like that, but it really secures the fabric to the batting really, really well. So I love this. I actually just went and bought this, and I got there and they didn't have any. They only had other brands, and I was like, oh God. And then I like fumbled through, and somehow like way in the back of the shelf I had like one can left. So I'm worried that maybe they're not gonna have this anymore. I also heard that the cans that are shorter than this, like maybe this tall, are especially pungent with the chemicals. So maybe that's a thing. Maybe if you like find one that's a little taller like that. I don't know if that really matters. So I'm gonna make my quilt sandwich. I'm gonna spray baste it, and then I'm going to do stitch in the ditch for my quilting. So I'm going to sew along the edge of each colored square here. If that makes sense. So for like this yellow one, let's do this green one. For the green one, I would stitch right along here, right down, over, up. Here is the quilt top with the batting in the middle and the backing. This is all basted together with that spray. And I think it's looking really, really good. Like I mentioned, I'm gonna go ahead now and stitch in the ditch around each one of these internal squares here. I think I have enough of this blue to do, back you up a bit here, to do the binding. So that will just be kind of a little rim of blue around the blue, and then we'll be done. The quilt is done. I'm really so very happy with it. The binding is all on, hand bound, which took quite a little bit of time, but completely worth it. I love all the colors together. I'm gonna take pictures and post them at the end of this video so you can really see the quilt in full. But I think you can get a pretty good sense here. The Rickrack is awesome. And I love that I was able to use all fabrics that I already had, except the dog fabric from Darlene. Part of what I love about this quilt is that I didn't know what it was going to be when I started out. I didn't know that there was going to be exactly 4 dogs and 4 accent items. I didn't know that I was going to do a dog per block. I kind of just went with the flow, and that allows for all kinds of really interesting surprises. The added rickrack, you know, the pairing of unexpected fabrics when you really just have to use what you've got. So I would encourage people to kind of give that a try, to search through what you have, pick something random and just see where it goes, because it's fun. I have found that when you're not using a pattern, there's 2 kind of ways. I'm sure there's many, many ways, but the 2 that I've found that are the easiest to create a quilt when you're not using a pattern is the first, what we did here, which is just creating blocks. So creating squares or rectangles and focusing on each block and kind of making that block your own. Then putting those blocks together either side by side or with sashing, adding a border. The other way is kind of to start with something in the center and to work out, which is what I did for the deer quilt, which is a series that I'll link for. It's kind of almost like a medallion kind of style, I would say, but it doesn't have to look like a typical medallion quilt. But you start with the center and then you add on your blocks as you go out. And so those might be borders, they might be actual, you know, 12 by 12 blocks going around, but you're kind of starting and going out instead of doing the blocks side by side. So if you want to give it a try, those are 2 methods that you can use. This has been awesome. Thank you so much for joining me. Here's some pictures. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.